Hi, this is Chris, and I support the Comics Alternative on Patreon. Thank you, Derek and Andy.
This is the Comics Alternative, episode 154, a look at the 2015 Ignatz Awards. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode of the podcast, Andy and I will be discussing this year's nominees for the Ignatz Awards. But before we get to that conversation, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the podcast is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you'll find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts go from 20 to 35% off cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible, unbelievable specials. And September is no exception. Sometimes those specials are at 40% off cover price. Sometimes they are 50% off cover price. But often you'll find discounts that go higher than that.
And you are going to find some incredible bundles. One of the bundles you're going to find is the September Valiant bundle, the 7 newest Valiant titles for 50% off. And that's not all. You're also going to find a Vertigo bundle. It's actually Vertigo bundle number 2, the 4 newest Vertigo titles for 50% off, and the Vertigo bundle number 1, 4 new Vertigo issues for 75% off.
You know, I like Vertigo comics, and I like them even better with those kind of discounts.
I do too.
Yes, and so I'm going to try it. You guys should too. Go to the website of our sponsor, dcbservice.com, to find those and other incredible specials. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs, and after you do pre-order your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and say, hey, you know how I found out about you guys? From the two guys with PhDs. They sent me.
That's right. Let them know.
So, Andy, this is a different kind of regular podcast episode in a number of ways. First off, this is going to be the first time that you and I are going to be talking about the Ignatz Awards. We've talked about the Eisner Awards in the past. We've talked a little bit about the Harveys, not much. But this is the first time that we're going to get into a deep, down and dirty discussion of the Ignatz nominees and then winners.
That's right. And there are a lot of great books and a lot of really tough categories that we were actually talking about a little bit earlier. Who knows what's going to win? I mean, we're not here to talk about what we think is going to win, but just to talk about some of the great books that are nominated.
That's right. And another thing that is different about this podcast episode is that we're going to deal with this in different ways. Now, we're recording this in your house here in Maryland, and I'm staying with you. We're attending SPX together. And earlier this evening, you and I just got back from that first day, Saturday. And I know both of us are exhausted. There was a lot that went on. And we can talk about our experiences at SPX. I'd like to do that. But what we thought we would do, in fact, as we're recording this right now, and I'm looking at the clock, it is 9:47 p.m. local time. They are in the middle of the ceremony for the awards at SPX. So we're going to be talking later on this episode about the winners. Tonight, we're going to talk briefly about our experiences at SPX, and then we're going to set up the nominees for the various categories for the Ignatz Awards. Then on Sunday, after Andy and I attend that last day at SPX, then we will finish up the podcast and talk about which books and which creators actually did get the Ignatz, but more specifically, we're going to get into a discussion of many of the nominees for this year. But so it's different in that this will be a 2-part recording. This is also a very different kind of episode in that this is the only so far regular episode that we have done live where both co-hosts are at the same location.
That's right. Other than Heroes Con,
but that was a special. That was not a regular
but
show.
That was a special episode, and this is a very unusual. Most listeners know, Derek, that you live in Texas and I live in Maryland, so usually we don't get together geographically. So this is a first.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So it's a first in many ways. Well, let's start off, Andy, by talking a little bit about our experiences at SPX today. Now, this is your second time there, right?
That's right.
And it was my first. So compare this to last year's event.
Well, I was telling Derek when we were driving over that last year, the first maybe half hour to 45 minutes, I felt like I was pretty much the only person in the place, and I was able to get several interviews last year with very few people in the room until maybe about 45 minutes had gone by. This year, that was not the case. As soon as we got there, and we got there just very shortly after 11 o'clock when the doors opened, the place was jam-packed in no time. I think there were many more people there today for the first day than I remember from last year. And I also was going by and I talked to some creators that said this is much busier than previous years for the first day.
Yeah, and in fact, once we got there and we got our press badges, when we went into the exhibition hall, you and I more or less parted ways and said, "Okay, well, I'll text you. If we need to hook up in a little while." And then, as I was making my way through the crowded aisles, I was thinking to myself, "There is no way that last year there were just a few people in this place," as you were telling me, because I was like, "Man, this place is really crowded." So it was significantly more attendees that early than last year, you're saying.
Yeah, yeah.
So because it didn't take long before some of the aisles were difficult to navigate.
Yeah, and it got to that position a lot quicker this year. I mean, it eventually got that way last year. It took a while, but it didn't take any time at all before. I mean, you were running into people, bumping into people, and just really having not a difficult time navigating, but not an easy time either.
Well, at times it was difficult.
At times
for me,
it was,
at least,
yeah,
depending on the aisle. And I'm not even talking about what was happening later in the day once some of the heavy hitters in terms of crowd pleasers were coming in. Mm-hmm. Now, I did not see, unfortunately, because I was doing other things, Scott McCloud, but you saw that he had a really long line at his table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he did have a long line too. And if you've never been to SPX before, the way it works is most all of the activity is in the grand ballroom, and most of the big heavy hitters that are signing have their tables inside the grand ballroom, but people are waiting outside the grand ballroom. So if you just walk by, it looks like Scott McCloud is just signing with one person, or Jessica Apel is signing with one person, or whoever. And once it's very easy to make a mistake of saying, "Oh, there's Scott McCloud and there's only one person in line. I'll just slide in." But they have plenty of people there to tell you, "Oh no, the line is out the door and around the corner."
Because those people who are going to be in bring in the bigger crowds are actually right near the entrance, or one of the entrances of the event hall. So there's that, and that's the same thing with Noelle Stevenson. I noticed that she had an incredibly long line, and she was sitting right inside of the door.
Yeah. And that's really neat in a way, because if you're not in the line, you can still see the big attraction. You can get pretty close to them. You're just not going to be able to sign anything until you get into the line. So I actually like the way they have it set up. It's very organized, and I noticed that there are people there that are volunteers that keep things going, keep things from becoming chaotic. They really do a good job of getting the big heavy hitters and keeping people moving. They do a good job.
Yeah, but the vast majority of the creators who were there do not have those kind of long lines. So this is going to be a different kind of con than many of our listeners may be used to. And it's not the usual kind of con that I'm familiar with. And I really like the fact that there are just a bare minimum number of people there who do warrant those really long lines.
Yeah, there really were very few. I mean, like you said, Derek, you got the Scott McClouds, you got the Noel Stevensons, and tomorrow I'm not sure exactly who we will have. I know that you and I are both looking forward to seeing Dylan Horrocks. Mm-hmm. It would be great if he has a long line. He deserves to have a long line. I'm not sure how many big lines we're going to see tomorrow.
Yeah. And we were talking on the way home earlier this evening. I really do want to get Scott McCloud to sign my copy of The Sculptor. However, if he has long lines as he did today, as you saw, because I was somewhere else when he had those long lines, then I don't know if I'm going to spend the time waiting 30, 45 minutes or so to get in line, because that's 30 or 45 minutes that I'm not introducing myself to creators whom I didn't know before, or talking with people for the podcast. And so, you get something, you lose something by standing in those lines.
It's a tough call, because a lot of the conventions you go to and you look at those lines and you think, well, I have another opportunity to see this person at another convention or another venue. If so, and if you're pretty confident that you're going to be able to see that person again, it might be best to wait and then do all the other things, like you said, talking to other creators that don't have the line. But you think about it and you think, am I ever going to see this person again? That's a tough call.
Yeah, it is. And we should mention that you and I are both doing quite a number of interviews while we're at SPX. And so we will edit those together and be publishing these interviews over this coming week. And some will go up before this episode goes up. Some may go up after. I'm thinking we'll have at least 2, maybe even 3 episodes worth of interviews. I know that we definitely will have 3 episodes worth of interviews, 2 of which will be shorter, let's say 5 to 10 minute interviews that you and I have been doing at the event. But then there's one that I'm going to publish separately. I did one this evening or this late afternoon with Bill Griffith, and we sat down for an hour and a half and talked.
Wow.
And that probably will have gone up by the time that this episode goes up. So if you're listening to this right now and you didn't hear the earlier show where I interviewed Bill Griffith, creator of Zippy the Pinhead, among other comics, then make sure you go back and listen to that. But that was a lot of fun. But on this particular show, we're talking about our experiences at SPX and also the Ignatz nominees. So let's start talking about some of the nominees. And then when we record the next part of this episode on Sunday, after we get back from that last day at SPX, we can go into the details about what these books were about. Mm-hmm. So let's look at the category of Outstanding Artist. We have Emily Carroll for Through the Woods, Ed Luce with Lovable Oaf, Roman Moradov with In a Sense, Lost and Found, Julian Tamaki, Super Mutant Magic Academy, and Noah Van Sciver, Saint Cole. Now, of these books, I think that you were familiar with at least a couple before they announced the nominees, correct?
I was. I had read In a Sense, Lost and Found, and we actually discussed
that on a previous podcast, yes.
And I had read Saint Cole, and I recently finished Super Mutant Magic Academy, and very recently Lovable Oaf. What else is on there? And Through the Woods, I'd read that quite a while back as well. So I was familiar with all of these. And Derek, I think you've read them all too.
I've read them all.
Yeah.
And the one that I was familiar with earliest, I guess, was Emily Carroll's Through the Woods. Mm-hmm. And I read Through the Woods before you and I started the webcomic series, because Emily Carroll, one of hers webcomics, was one of the ones we looked at that very first episode.
That's right.
But I liked Through the Woods, and it was in fact one of my top 10 favorites of last year. So I'm coming into this category kind of predisposed to Through the Woods, but I mean, there are a lot of really good ones here, and we can go into detail about what we like about them when we come back on Sunday.
Sure.
Now let's look at the next category is Outstanding Anthology or Collection. And here we have, oh my God, a lot of great stuff. There is the Drawn and Quarterly, 25 Years of Contemporary Cartooning, Comics, and Graphic Novels. And this is edited by a variety of individuals at Drawn and Quarterly, and it is a big tome of a text. I did not bring my copy with me when I came up here because there was only so much space I had in my bags, and this would have taken up the majority of that space. Another book is something that we have discussed on the podcast before, Andy Kunka and I, when we did our publisher spotlight on Retrofit and Big Planet, and that is Box Brown's An Entity Observes All Things. And then another nominee in that category is Eleanor Davis's How to Be Happy, which is one of those books that we probably should have talked on the podcast when it came out, but we didn't, even though it has been mentioned one or two times. Then after that is one that you and I have discussed before, and that is Ethan Riley's Pope Hats number 4. When back in July when we did the Ad House Publisher Spotlight, that was one of the titles we looked at. And then again, here we have Julian Tamaki's Super Mutant Magic Academy. And Andy, one of the things that strikes me about this anthology or collection category is that with the exception of Drawn and Quarterly, all of these, I guess, fall under the collection because with Super Mutant Magic Academy, Pope Hats, How to Be Happy, and An Entity Observes All Things, you have the same creator who is pulling together all of her or his smaller or shorter stories into one collection.
That's true. So the Drawn and Quarterly is really the only true anthology in this category, and it's called Anthology or Collection. And the scope and the range of these books is so vastly different, too, because, again, as you mentioned, the Drawn and Quarterly is an enormous book. I forget how many hundreds of pages it is. I would say at least probably 500 or 600 pages.
It's Moby Dick.
It's Moby Dick. And then on the other hand, you've got Pope Hats, which is basically a single issue. But there's a lot of short stories in it. So in a way, it's almost unfair that these 5 are grouped together, and the other books are everything in between. The Box Brown book is not a very long book. Super Mutant Magic Academy, a larger book, and then
which began as a webcomic,
and that began as a webcomic, and then How to Be Happy is about a standard size of a book. So you got quite a bit of diversity just in the size of those books.
Right. And I'm glad that you pointed out the quote-unquote unfair aspect of this category, because there's something else about this category that bothers me that I think is a little unfair. I mean, I think every single one of the books in this category deserves to be there. It would have been a lot better if they had broken up anthology and collection. And this is why I think it is extra unfair in that, in addition to what you had pointed out, there are so many wonderful comics anthologies that are out there right now that it surprises me that the only anthology that they were able to bring up for this category was the Drawn and Quarterly one. Now, for me, that's kind of a no-brainer because that was a big media or comics media event when this came out. It got a lot of attention, and deservedly so. But there are many anthologies, and I'm talking about anthology in the purer sense, not collections as we have here, that are doing great things and falling under the radar. And I'll give you one example of an anthology that definitely should be here, and that is Irene.
Right.
And that is a collection, an anthology that is edited by Dakota McFadzean, Andy Warner, and D.W., and we've talked about that on the show at least a couple of different times. We haven't reviewed one of the titles, but we've mentioned it here or there. And I know that last year when I interviewed Dakota McFadzean, we discussed Irene as well. That's an incredible anthology. Why isn't it here? And I've heard creators say, it's really sad that we don't have the kind of anthologies that we used to have. In some ways we do. They're just not getting the kind of attention that other collections, like for instance Fantagraphics' Mome, which I love, and I mourn its passing still. But there are other anthologies like Irene that are doing the exact same thing, but they're flying under the radar of even the people who are overseeing the Ignatz Awards.
Right. And I would love for them to expand this into 2 categories. And like you said, Derek, there are plenty of anthologies out there to justify its own category. And we would also get more books in front of people as a result of that, which would always be a good thing.
That's right. Now, the next category we have is Outstanding Graphic Novel. And again, every single thing, every one of these entries deserves to be here. There is Beauty by Carousset and Hubert. And I'm sure I'm butchering those names. And in fact, we've had 1 or 2 listeners who take me to task for my French pronunciation.
Yeah, pronunciations are not our strong point.
And there is friend of the show, Sophie Goldstein, with The Oven. You and I spoke about The Oven on the Ad House program back in July. And then Mickey Zakili. It's Zakili or Dachili. Zachili. It's Zachilli. Rav. This is her book. And then Noah Van Sciver's St. Cole. And then Walter Scott's Wendy. Now, I know that you and I are familiar with all of these. I have to say that before the nominations, the only one that I didn't know of was Zachilli's Rav. But now you and I have been sent copies of that, and so we've read it. This is going to be a tough category.
Yeah, the books in this category are all very, very different from one another. Beauty is an absolutely gorgeously illustrated and colored book, kind of a fairy tale takeoff. The Oven we've discussed on the show is a somewhat science fiction-ish type of look at relationships. Rav, wow, I don't know. I don't know how to describe it.
Yeah, we'll have a fun time discussing this tomorrow night.
We'll discuss this one tomorrow night. St. Cole, I think this is one of Noah Van Sciver's strongest works that I've read. Very strong graphic novel. And then Wendy from Walter Scott. Again, these are all very, very different. This is a graphic novel about a young woman in the art world. All of these books are good. All of these books are worthy. They're all unique. It's going to be interesting to see what wins this.
Yeah, again, trying to analyze the category. Now, this is Outstanding Graphic Novel. Some of these books have been serialized and then collected into, I guess, what we call and what they're definitely calling a graphic novel. Others, on the other hand, for instance, like Sophie Goldstein's The Oven, were not serialized, but they were created from beginning to end as a coherent, longer narrative.
Right.
Now I have no problem with putting the serialized then novelized into the same category as the from beginning to end it came out as a coherent one point it was right there graphic novel. So I mean that's fine with me, but if they're going to expand the categories, then maybe they could make some kind of differentiation. But then you'd get into definitions of, an original graphic novel, which would be one of those like The Oven or Beauty that was not serialized originally.
Right.
And that may get a little sticky, but...
Well, and we're getting into semantics too. I mean, you can talk about, was this a graphic novel from a different source? Did it come from a webcomic? Is it a collected edition, or is it an original graphic novel? And we have a wide variety here.
Yeah. The next category, Outstanding Story. One that you and I discussed in an episode last year is Dash Shawn's The Doctors. And then Michael DeForge has one of his stories from Loose number 6, and that is Me as a Baby. And then a story from another collection by Marguerite Van Cook and James Romberg, their book, The Late Child and Other Animals. The story in this collection is Animal Lessons. And then a story from the serial Frontier, an anthology, Julian Tamaki's Sex Coven. And then finally, Chris Muke's Weeping Flower Grows in Darkness.
And Derek, I think you have all of these. Did you get Weeping Flower?
We did not get a copy.
We did not get that. I know we did not get a review copy of that.
And we should mention that when we saw that the nominations were out, or soon after, we got in touch with either the artists or the publishers or the distributors to see if we could get some kind of access, whether hard copy ideally or even PDF if they didn't have a hard copy they could send, to get them to us so we could discuss all of the nominees on this episode. And there were just a few people who never got back in touch with me. And it could be that they were busy or they never got the email, or maybe I sent it to the wrong individual. But I tried to contact Chris Muke. I'm not sure how you pronounce the last name. That was someone that I never heard back from. And I don't know who distributes this or where one could get a copy. So we're coming into that one ignorant. But the other ones you and I have now read.
And Derek, even though I have not read Weeping Flower, I think this may be my favorite category. All the other four that I read, those are such strong stories. And I'm really glad that The Doctors is nominated because it came out so long ago. It's one of those things that you almost think, well, this could have been overlooked easily because I think it was the first thing published out of this list, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
But that's
that or DeForge's Loose Number, the story from Loose Number 6.
I bought Loose Number 6 last year at SPX, so that actually may have been the first one out of this group that was published. But all of these are very strong stories, very powerful. They're really just unforgettable stories. So if listeners have not picked up these, I would urge them to. Whoever wins, it's apples and oranges. These are all great stories.
Now, it's been a long time since you and I discussed Doctors, and I did not bring my copy with me. But at first I was surprised that this was in the Outstanding Story category because I thought of this not so much as a story, but as a short book.
Or a novella.
Or a novella, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, me too.
So maybe that would qualify it as a outstanding story. And they didn't want to create another category for the novella. Okay, so the category following that, as we're looking on the Ignatz Awards webpage, is Promising New Talent. And here, this is really fun because it introduces us to a point of a lot of very exciting people. I say to a point because there were one or two people here that we already knew of. So we were ahead of the game there. One is M. Dean is the creator, M. Dean. That's how she's publicizing herself. That's her name professionally. And this book has an interesting title. The one that she's nominated for is KM and RP and 1971, but the 1971 is in Roman numerals. So you have what looks like a string of letters that make it a difficult title. And in fact, when I did get in touch with M. Dean, and she said that she would send us copies, as she did, of her book, she apologized for the title. And I said, no, that's what makes it intriguing.
I actually did a Google search on that, and I had got all kinds of interesting things when I typed in the title.
So there's that. And then another nominee is by Sophia Foster Domino, and that is Sphincter, and also Sex Fantasy. And then the one creator that I definitely knew about under this Promising New Talent category is Dakota McFadzine. And what they're listing here for him is his really big collection that came out earlier this year from Conundrum, Don't Get Eaten by Anything. And you and I discussed this.
We did. We both enjoyed that.
The Conundrum show. After that is June May's Soft, which is kind of a I have a copy of that. It's kind of a hefty mini comic. And then following that is, I have to say, one of the most unusual comics of this entire year's list of nominees, and that's including Michael DeForge. And this is Gina Winbrandt's Big Pussy. And I look forward to talking about this tomorrow into more detail. And in fact, I had the pleasure of talking
you met her
with Gina.
today.
Yes.
Right, yeah.
And she is in person very much like the content of this mini comic. It really is impressive. So after that, the Outstanding Series, and here are a number of titles, some of which I was familiar with before, some not. And of the latter category is Georgia Weber's Dumb. this is I'm looking forward to us discussing Dung and what this is all about, because I think that it's very clever series.
Yeah, it's a very intriguing series, and yeah, there will be a lot to discuss with this one.
Yeah, and in another one that was nominated earlier for another category is Frontier, and this is edited by Ryan Sands. And we got to give a special shout out to Ryan, because he sent us multiple issues of Frontier, because I was only asking for, issue number 7. Mm-hmm. But he sent us multiple issues and then other works as well that have been published by Youth in Decline, like, for instance, Rav. So, again, thank you very much, Ryan. We couldn't do these kind of shows without people like you.
Yeah, Ryan, it was wonderful for you to go way above and beyond what we were expecting. So, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Now, following that this is probably the most conventional, at least for SPX, of the titles nominated this year, and this is John Lewis's, Andrew Aiden, and Nate Powell's March. This is book 2. And then after that is, once again, Ethan Riley's Pope Hats, number 4. And then after that is, again, once again, Sophia Foster Domino's Sex Fantasy. And then in the next category, and this is interesting, I'm curious about how one distinguishes outstanding comic from some of these other categories. But maybe it's something to talk about. So let's run down the list of nominees for this category. Jason Little's Borb, Dissa Wallender's Nature of Nature, Sophie Goldstein's The Oven, Ethan Riley's Pope Hats number 4, and Chris Mouquet's Weeping Flower Grows in Darkness.
Mm-hmm. So we've got 3 titles that we've seen in at least one other category here.
Yes, exactly. And I'm just curious. I should have. I spoke with Sophie Goldstein today, and one of the things I forgot to ask her, because she was, I think, on the committee.
She's on the board, not the board, but the jurors.
Yeah. So of course, she couldn't say anything about her own books,
right?
But I would be curious to ask, and I forgot to today, about the process of the nominations. And I'm wondering now how they define and distinguish outstanding comic from, let's say, some of the other categories, like outstanding story, and then outstanding graphic novel. Because some of these, the outstanding graphic novel and then the outstanding comic, both have The Oven. So how are you making this distinction?
I would like to see the criteria for that, and I know they have a criteria. It's got to be written down somewhere, but I have never seen it. Yeah.
So, and if they do make it public, I don't know where to find it. I haven't seen it. Now, this next one is interesting. Outstanding mini comic, and this is a category that you would expect from Ignatz. There is Patrick Crotty's Devil's Slice of Life, John Pham's Epoxy number 5, John Porcelino's King Cat number 75, Sophia Foster Domino's Sex Fantasy number 4, and Audrey's Wallen, A Reckoning. And this is one of those categories that I tell you, of the 5 nominees, I'm only familiar with 3. I know that I've tried to reach out to Audrey for some kind of copy of Wallen, A Reckoning, and then John Pham, his Epoxy number 5. Never heard back from him, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So, I'm going to have to plead ignorant when we discuss these in more detail tomorrow.
Well, same thing here, and I'm only familiar with 2 of them, King Cat number 75 and Sex Fantasy number 4.
Oh, that's right, because I got a copy of Devil's Slice of Life.
Yeah. And again, people that have never been to SPX should know that if you're into mini comics, you will be in heaven. There are so many mini comics out there. That's one of the categories that I don't know how you would narrow it down to 5. There are so many there. There are so many that I looked at today, and I actually picked up several mini comics. But it's an overwhelming number of mini comics there.
Yeah. And then the final category is Outstanding Online Comic. Here we have Lily Carey's The Bloody Footprint, Lauren Weinstein's Carriers, Rebecca Rohr's Mom Body, Blue Delicante's Old Human Star, and Ariel Reese's Witchy. So those are going to be interesting titles to look at as well. So, unlike the Harveys and then the Eisners, you don't have a long list of categories, but you do have a substantial list, and I think that there's just a lot to choose from in this year's nominees of the Ignatz Awards.
There's quite a lot of good stuff. There's quite a lot of variety. There is something for everybody, I think, as we alluded to earlier in each of these categories. If you wanted to only read the comics that were nominated, I think you would have a really good idea of what Small Press Expo is like.
Exactly, yeah, that's a good point. And in fact, I scrolled back up toward the top of that page, and they do have that list of jurors, and you mentioned earlier that Sophie Goldstein is one. We should mention that some of the others include Lamar Abrams, Cara Bean, Robin Chapman, and Corinne Muka. So those are the, 5 jurors for this year. And I'm wondering how they worked around the fact that Sophie is one of the jurors, yet she's nominated more than once. That's got to be difficult.
I know that from some of the other awards panels that I've known of, I've never been on one, but usually when that type of thing happens, I think the person that's nominated excuses themselves from that category, or they just abstain for that category and they vote on the ones that they are not in. I would assume that's the same situation here.
Yeah. So, Sophie gets this, whether she wins or not, she has a big hand in this year's Ignatz nominees. And she won last year. Was it last year for House of Women? I know that one. Maybe it's 2 years ago.
Maybe it could have been last year. Yeah.
So anyway, Andy and I are going to come back tomorrow, and after our last day, we're probably going to be exhausted at SPX, and to discuss in detail some of these titles that we've been mentioning. Now, we're not going to talk about which ones we think we voted for, because we should mention that attendees get to vote. Mm-hmm. So, if you just come in, you pay your ticket of admission and get in, you can vote for all of these categories. And both Andy and I voted. We don't want to tip our hand on who we voted for, because many of these categories, I have to admit, it was tough making a decision.
Yeah, it was. And in fact, we were having a conversation in the car on the way back about who we voted for. And it was interesting what we voted for and who we think will win. And it's going to be really interesting to see who does win. I remember last year when I voted, and I had not read nearly as many of the books last year as I have this year, but there were some surprises, and there may be some surprises tonight.
Yeah. So of today's SPX, who you spoke with, what happened there, who you ran into, who you met, what was one of the most outstanding moments for you?
I really enjoyed speaking with Julian Hanshaw, whose graphic novel Tim Ginger has been out not very long. That was a book that really affected me emotionally and personally in a deep way. In fact, I thought about, Derek, writing a review of this for the Comics Alternative, but it affected me in such a personal way, and there were a lot of personal things that I wanted to deal with that I put on my own blog, and I actually told Julian about that, and we had a great conversation. He's a great guy. He's one of those guys that, you read a book and you feel like this guy has been where I've been. He knows what I've gone through, and I had the same feeling talking to him. It was like talking to somebody that you've known for years. So that was probably the best moment for me today.
Now, I can't remember. Did you tell me that you did talk with him for the podcast?
We did. We spoke. We did a brief interview today for the podcast.
So that by the time this episode that we're recording now goes up, that conversation you had with him may have already gone up.
That will probably have already gone up.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I would urge anyone who has not read that book to give it a try.
Now, I have to raise my hand. I'm one of those who has not read that book yet. Now, I have it, and I just haven't gotten around to it yet. But we will discuss this on the Comics Alternative in October, because Andy and I are going to do a publisher spotlight on top shelf books and their seasonal releases. And Hanshaw's book is one of those that we're going to be discussing. So I'm looking forward to that. So what you're saying here about being very personal and moving, I mean, you're really piquing my interest.
Well, what about you, Derek? Was there any big surprise or what the highlight of today for you?
Well, in terms of a big surprise, it was the crowds. I didn't expect there to be that many people at SPX. And I know it's a much smaller, more contained area than the cons that I'm used to. So, and I think for that reason, it may have been the same number of people at a place like Dallas Fan Expo or a Wizard World. It would have seemed sparse. But for this relatively small exhibition hall, it was quite crowded. And so I think that experience surprised me a little, not necessarily in a negative way, although there were a couple of times where I was having problems moving through the crowd, and that pissed me off. But that's me. So that was a surprising bit. The highlight, I have to admit, it's talking with Bill Griffith, and I know I've mentioned that earlier, so I don't want to talk too much about that. But he is a hero of mine, and being able to sit down and talk with the creator of Zippy was just the highlight of the weekend. I'm sure. I don't care what happens tomorrow. Still talking with Bill Griffith is the highlight. And in fact, an interesting thing, I was telling you about this earlier. An interesting thing happened right after my interview with Bill Griffith. In order for us to have at least somewhat private space to talk that didn't have near as much ambient noise, we moved out of the exhibition hall into a couple of seats in the lounge area. There was still the ambient sound, but it was relatively minimal. So we sat down and we talked for about an hour and a half, and then at the end of that conversation, Bill had to go back to his room. So he, said, thank you, it was a great interview, and so he left. And then as I was packing up my recording equipment, this woman came over to talk to me, and she was a mother, and I know that because she said, my son and I were passing by a little while ago while you were talking with that gentleman. Who was he? And of course, I could tell immediately that she wasn't there for XPX. And I said, oh, well, that there's a comics convention going on here. And this is one of the creators who is a special guest, and in fact, he's kind of a legend in comics. His name is Bill Griffith. And she said, oh, well, my son wanted to know who this guy was that was being interviewed in the lobby. Now, I could tell she didn't know who Bill Griffith was, but I said, have you read Zippy the Pinhead in your newspaper? And her eyes lit up. She said, oh, yeah, I'm familiar with Zippy. I said, that's the guy who created Zippy. And so she said, oh, my God, I'll have to tell my son. And so that was a great follow-up experience to that interview. But I really had a good time. Now, I had a great time talking with everyone today. Wonderful conversations that our listeners, some of which they may have heard already by the time this show goes up. Some, it depends on how many episodes we're able to get out of these interviews, may go up later, like on a Thursday or a Friday. But we are going to be coming up with quite a number of shows from our SPX experience.
Yeah, and it's going to be, like you said, there were so many people to talk to, and we're going to try to hit more people tomorrow, so that's great.
Okay. So Andy and I wanted to get on the mic after our first day at SPX and give you a little taste of what we went through, what we experienced, and then to introduce the nominees for this year's Ignatz Awards. And then tomorrow, Andy and I will pick up where we left off and talk about the Ignatz nominees and winners, we'll know who those are by that point, in a little more detail. So we will be back on the other side. Now, this will be no time difference for you because you're listening to this podcast. In the next few seconds, it'll be Sunday for us.
That's right.
And we're back. It is Sunday evening. Andy and I have just recently returned from the second day of Small Press Expo. So we wanted to pick up where we left off in discussing this year's Ignatz nominees. And as we said in the previous segment, we wanted to do a setup. As we did, we gave a list of all the nominees in the various categories for this year's Ignatz Awards. And now we want to talk about those books, most of them at least, in some detail. Now, before we get to that discussion, Andy, we should let our listeners know that since we recorded yesterday's segment, what they just finished listening to, they have announced the Ignatz winners. And in fact, the Ignatz Awards were going on as we were recording on Saturday evening around, 9:30, 9:45 or so.
Yeah.
So if you want to go through the category and tell our listeners, if they don't already know, who won an Ignatz Award.
Sure. And Derek, do you want me to just read down the list? And
yeah, you don't have to list all the nominees, but just who the winners were.
Okay. For Outstanding Artist, the winner was Emily Carroll for Through the Woods. Outstanding Anthology or Collection, How to Be Happy by Eleanor Davis. Outstanding Mini Comic, Sex Fantasy No. 4, Sophia Foster Domino. Outstanding Story, Sex Coven from Frontier No. 7 by Jillian Tamaki. Outstanding Series, Sex Fantasy, again by Sophia Foster Domino. Promising New Talent, Sophia Foster Domino for Sex Fantasy and Sphincter. Outstanding Comic was given to The Oven by Sophie Goldstein. The Outstanding Graphic Novel was also The Oven by Sophie Goldstein. And the Outstanding Webcomic, The Bloody Footprint by Lily Carey.
So there you go. Those were the guys who were winning the awards, as you and I last night were talking about who might just do that, or at least going through the list of the nominees.
But we can't call them guys.
The people. And I use guys in a non-gendered sense just because it's relatively easy, but maybe I should start going for the non-easy way of signifying individuals. So, and in fact, I know you were joking, but it is interesting to note that there was some truth in what you said. One of the things that makes this year's awards so outstanding is the fact that if you guys listening to this, guys, girls, men and women, if you listeners out there didn't realize this, every single one of the winners for this year's Ignatz Awards were women. And that has gotten a lot of attention. It's gotten a bit of press. People were talking about it today. Mm-hmm. We noticed that last night folks started to tweet about it. So, and it is a significant event. So that's one of the things that will make this year's Ignatz Awards memorable. Now, when Andy and I, after we finished the recording last night, and we did see who had won the awards, we had mixed feelings, and I don't want to go into too much detail about how we were disappointed, or how we would have if we could have chosen the winners, who actually deserved that. Because we should point out that the way that the winners are decided is by open democratic vote. Anybody who attends Small Press Expo, and it could be an exhibitor, it could be a publisher, it could be the press. Andy and I both voted. Mm-hmm. It can be people who just come in, get a badge, want to be just a part of the action. Anyone can fill out a ballot, and so that's how the Ignatz Awards are chosen. There is not we mentioned that there are judges on a panel, but they come up with the nominees. But these judges have nothing to do with the selection of the winner. Again, it is kind of an open, more democratic vote. So this is the people's voice. This is what they decided. Andy and I, though, were a little surprised at some of the things that were missing in terms of the people who weren't winning. And I don't know about you, Andy, but one of the biggest surprises for me was that Noah Van Sciver, who was nominated in two categories, the Outstanding Artist, and he was also nominated, St. Cole, for the Outstanding Graphic Novel, won neither.
I was surprised at that as well, and I will go ahead and tell the audience that the only ballot choice that I made that ended up winning was the very first one, Outstanding Artist. I did vote for Emily Carroll for Through the Woods because I thought that was an outstanding collection. Not that the other artists were not. This was a really, really tough category. I was giving my vote to Noah Van Sciver for the outstanding graphic novel. But his artwork on St. Cole was just, it was tremendous. All of the ones in the best outstanding artist, really, really good stuff. I mean, Derek, I really don't have a problem at all with Emily Carroll winning that. Everything in that category was very strong. So I think that was a really good choice. And again, it was the choice that I made as well.
Exactly. Another surprise for me was you had Ethan Riley, who was nominated, and this is Doug Wright Award winner. He was nominated 3 times. Let me see. Pope Hats #4 was nominated for Best Anthology or Collection, Best Outstanding Series, and also Outstanding Comic. So it was nominated 3 times, didn't win once. So again, I found that a little surprising just because of the math. You would think that he would have at least won something in there. So that's what struck me. And, I could go into an explanation of other things that surprised me about the people who actually won, but I don't want to do that. I think that all of the comics here that the ones that we read, because as we mentioned last night, we did not get copies of every single one of these comics, but we got the vast majority, and the ones that we've read, I thought were interesting. I thought were really good. Some were truly outstanding. And it's an interesting selection this year. So, yeah, it is a notable year for the Ignatz Awards. And what we want to do, after revealing who the winners were and to make a few comments about that, is to go into a little more detail about the books that were actually nominated. Now, some of these titles we've already been discussing on the Comics Alternative in previous episodes. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, we did discuss last year, I believe it was, Roman Muradov's In a Sense, Lost and Found from Nobrow Press. And I don't know if we'll go into too much detail about the books that we've already discussed, but we could. So, I don't know. Do you want to go by category, or do you want to talk about just individual titles as they come up?
There's so many books that overlap. We could go by books as they come up if you want, but because there are so many that overlap. You had mentioned something about Emily Carroll's Through the Woods. Now, that was one of my top 10 books from last year. We didn't discuss it on the podcast, which was unfortunate, but I know that you and I did discuss one of her webcomics. I think it was the very first episode of the webcomic series back in December. And I had read Through the Woods, and one of the things that I absolutely loved about Through the Woods, well, actually a variety of things, is that these are a series of individual tales, and that they're gothic. They were perfect for Halloween. And I think, did the book come out about that time in October or September? I'm pretty sure it did come out in the late fall, so that does make sense if I remember correctly.
Okay. And not only is Carol's writing just outstanding, but also her artwork. It truly stands out. And another thing that really excited me about Through the Woods, and I think I've said it on the show before, maybe our year-end show, is that I appreciate it because it strikes me as a kind of graphic cycle, in that you have a series of individual short pieces that stand easily on their own. But in this case, they're thematically linked. Because in a story cycle, for instance, when you're talking about prose fiction, the short story cycle is a collection of stories that individually stand on their own, but they're linked in a relatively coherent way, many times through character or setting, sometimes through theme. But usually it's character or setting that gives it a kind of binding that you don't get in more, shall we say, traditional short story collections. But at the same time, a short story cycle is not a novel. You don't have that kind of interwoven cohesiveness. So what I've called in the past, in some of the writing that I've done, a graphic cycle, you have a series of stories that, again, could stand on their own, but nonetheless have some kind of binding woven into the fabric of the book as a whole. Now, thematically, I think this is how the stories hang well together in Through the Woods. The Gothic element but I do think that these are not just individual stories that, she plopped in here or there. This is almost like a novel in terms of its scope, even though it is composed of a variety of different stories. So that really excited me. And, when you said earlier that the books in the outstanding artist category really difficult to decide on. That one I really enjoyed. I absolutely love Noah Van Sciver's Saint Cole. The thing about Noah Van Sciver, he's all over the place. How many publishers does he not work with?
Right.
That may be a quicker way of answering than, the question, how many publishers does he work with?
Right.
I also enjoyed Gillian Tamaki's Super Mutant Magic Academy. I know you and I were talking about that yesterday on our drive to SBX. Now, what are your thoughts on Super Mutant Magic Academy?
I liked it quite a bit, and I know it's got a webcomic background, and the thing about it that I liked initially is it is more of a comic strip, especially early on. Toward the end, you get some more of an arc that you would see like in a typical graphic novel, and things start to come together. But I like the style. I like the irreverence of it. The humor in it is very good. We actually have this book in the library in the young adult section, and some of my colleagues and I have bandied about whether this needs to be an adult book or a teen book. I really don't think it matters where you put it, but it is a lot of fun to look at something like this, and this type of thing is very popular, not only because you've got Harry Potter taking place at a school, you've got X-Men taking place at a school. So this is just it's not just another version of that, but it is a different take on it. There's a little bit more humor, there's a little bit more irreverence. The characters are very richly drawn. You get to know these characters very, very early on. It doesn't take many pages before you can get into these characters and know what they're about. Even though these are all pretty short stories, they work really well as short stories and together as a whole.
Yeah. Well, short stories, as you pointed out when you first started talking about it, they're strips.
Right.
And at least throughout most of the book, each strip is distinct. In other words, the stories aren't sequential. Now, they all take place in the same setting, the academy, and they deal with the same characters or the same collection of characters. It's not until the end of the book that Tamaki starts to cohesively string or link one story to the one that previously followed. So you do get short storylines in the last part of this. And to me, again, we were talking about this yesterday, it's not that it bothered me. I felt that the book was a little imbalanced because of that. Mm-hmm. So for the first, 2/3 or 3/4, you have a series of distinct strips, like you would find in newspaper strips, but these were web comics. And so you have one installment, many times like a gag strip, and then the next one, and then the next one. They all had the same character group. They all were set in the same location, but they were distinct strip, strip, strip. But then you get toward the last quarter of the book, and you start to see a more cohesive story, which is fine, except for the fact that earlier we had something that was very different. Now, again, that doesn't necessarily have to be a problem. But this reminded me of something that you and I have discussed before on the webcomic show. There's something about the creation of a webcomic that the narrative is much more fluid, that the story can change over time given the very nature of a webcomic. When we were talking about I can't remember which webcomic it was, but there are many that we have discussed that use or that had a very active follower comment section.
Right.
And sometimes, as we've mentioned a number of times, sometimes those comments probably help to influence where the narrative goes because you react to reader response. Some creators do, some don't. And then that may be an indication, the response, of where to take the story. So if the artist, if the creator doesn't have a clear sense of where he or she wants to go in their narrative trajectory, then it may have a kind of meandering feel to it, which I think is okay for a webcomic. But if you take that webcomic and translate it in, so to speak, translate it into a print, quote-unquote graphic novel, or whatever one chooses to call these things, it has a different feel. And so that's why the imbalance toward the last part of Super Mutant Magic Academy, I was okay with, but there was something a little off about it for me in the reading experience.
I understand what you're saying, definitely. But I wondered if that was a way to bring closure to the book. And I have not read the webcomic, so I don't know at what point, perhaps at some point, Tamaki made a decision from the webcomic to the print comic that, I need to wrap this up, or there needs to be some closure to it. Again, reminding me of the Harry Potter books. J.K. Rowling could have had the Harry Potter books just go on and on and on and on past year 7, or smaller stories within each year, but there's closure there. And maybe Tamaki decided, this book or this cycle needs closure at the end, which she does achieve.
And that's a good point, that maybe this was something that did give a sense of an ending, that going the way she had been with strip, distinct strip, one right after another, maybe that was a difficult way, if not almost an impossible way to end a book like this. So that's a good point.
Yeah. And so I don't know. It's almost one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't. But I think that was the right decision for this book to end it the way that she did. And if you haven't read it, we hope that you will read it. It's very much worthwhile.
Another one in that category, Outstanding Artist, is Ed Luce's Woveable Oaf. And, as we mentioned in yesterday's segment, I was unfamiliar with Woveable Oaf until the Ignatz nominations. And so I read the book. I enjoyed it. It wasn't one of my favorite, but it was fun. And as I said, it reminded me of Henry and Glenn Forever, just because of the topic and also the art. Luce also wrote at least one of, Tom Neely's Henry and Glenn Forever comics. And so there's a lot of this kind of heavy metal kind of a feel to it. It's kind of a loose story. Different things happen in different ways and unexpected manners. It's kind of wild. So it is fun in that sense. But I was glad to be introduced to Woveable Oaf. And then we come to St. Cole. And you and I have talked about how much we love St. Cole. I mean, this is really a solid story. Earlier in the year when we had Noah Van Sciver on the show and we talked with him right after St. Cole came out, I think one of the things that marks Noah Van Sciver as a storyteller is his characterization. And the story's fine, the premise, but it's the way that he constructs the individual character, his protagonist, that I think really stands out. Gene and I were talking just the other week about My Hot Date. Now, that's an autobiographical comic, but the way he writes about himself in many ways is similar to the way he writes about the protagonist in St. Cole. I mean, someone who's maybe a loser, someone that we feel kind of pathetic in a way, but we feel sorry for, or more importantly, we can empathize with. And that's the big thing. He writes in an empathic manner.
Yeah. And the thing that I like about this story, and you're right, Van Sciver has a way of understanding these characters that are almost on the fringe. I mean, the character in St. Cole is a guy who is really trying to make it in life. He's trying to do the right thing. He's gotten married. He's in a bad work situation. His mother-in-law comes to live with him. Things are not really easy. He's trying to make the best of it, but he makes some bad choices. And you see this a lot in a lot of Van Sciver's work. Guys that make bad choices, that are trying to think that, maybe something good is coming around the corner. This story, I think, is his strongest story of his that I have read because, like you said, Derek, the characterizations are so good. We can identify with him. We see what he's going through. We've, maybe to some extent we've been through what he's going through, the bad job, the relationship that's got problems. But there's also an element in St. Cole that is, I don't want to say otherworldly, but takes on a massive significance. And the book is so powerful. In fact, I was telling you earlier today that I talked to Van Sciver, and we were talking about this book, and I said this book had a really deep effect on me that it was so powerful. And by the time I got to the end, it was such a tremendous ending. And he said it was a tremendous ending for me too, because I was glad it was over. So you could tell that he really put a lot of himself into it, and it does come across in the book. It's a very powerful book.
Yeah, and I think getting back to the empathy and the emotional impact, it's something that not a lot of the books in this year's list of nominees. Not all of them have. Some do, but not near to the impact, or to the extent that Noah Van Sciver does. And, we were talking about the protagonist, Joe. You're right. He's someone who does dumbass things, and we could point our finger at him, but there's something that we want to like about. In other words, there's that empathy there, and we found that even with the historical figure of Abe Lincoln in The Hypo, which came out about a year and a half ago,
a couple of years. I think.
So even when he writes historical figures, he writes them in a way that we can relate to in one form or another, because this is not the historical man, the president who freed the slaves. This is someone who we see early in his career, kind of bumbling, doesn't always make the right decision, like Joe in St. Cole, but we nonetheless root for.
Right.
Yeah. In terms of the empathy, if we want to stick on that for a moment, another writer who I think is very good in terms of empathic the way that she handles her characters in an empathic manner is Eleanor Davis in How to Be Happy. Now, this is a collection of stories. We've talked about Eleanor Davis on the show before. I believe it was last year's Best American Comics 2014 that she had a piece, and it was one that actually is collected in How to Be Happy. But there are many of those stories where you do get a sense of who the people are, and you can see where they're coming from, and you feel for them. So she, in many ways, like Noah Van Sciver, is great when it comes to character studies.
Yeah, and one of the, I think is maybe the very first story in that collection was the kind of the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve story. Was that the very first one?
Was that the first one, or was it the one that was collected in Best American Comics? And the title escapes me. I didn't bring that copy to the table of that book.
But the thing about Eleanor Davis's collection is it has so many fantasy elements, and it has so many just real life elements to it as well. And there's a good combination of those. And I think one of the things that she is trying to bring across is that those things, the fantasy world and the reality world, go hand in hand. And it's part of our everyday lives, whether we live in a 9-to-5 reality or not. There's that fantasy element, that weird element in all of our lives. And she does such a great job of combining that. And especially with the different art styles that she does. Some of this book is in black and white. Some of it is in color. Both are very effective. In fact, I don't remember seeing a book that's both black and white and color that works effectively so well.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And, she's one of those creators at SPX that I'm really sorry I missed. I wanted to get her to sign my copy of How to Be Happy. And when I saw her yesterday, when I was at the Fantagraphics table, it was immediately after I had taken a bunch of books back to your car toward the end of the day. And one of the books that I left in the car was How to Be Happy. And I didn't want to run back. I couldn't really run back and get it in time. Another book that we've already mentioned that's gotten nominated a number of times, and like How to Be Happy, this was nominated in the Outstanding Anthology or Collection, is Ethan Riley's Pope Hats. And I think he deals with character, since we were talking about character as well. This issue of Pope Hats, as we discussed several months ago, is different from issues 1 through 3 of Pope Hats in that these aren't stories that in some slight way, but for all practical purposes do not in any way really touch upon the storylines that he had mapped out in issues 1, 2, and 3. So this is kind of like a break, and really is aware of this, and he even mentions in this comic that, yes, I know that many of you are going to want a continuation of, the storyline in Pope Hats. This, though, is going to be, a series of different stories. Just hang in there. The next issue we'll pick up back where we left off. But the individual stories here make this an interesting issue, and I guess this is why it's in the Outstanding Anthology or Collection category, which leads me to another thing that surprised both of us, is the fact that Drawn and Quarterly, 25 years of contemporary cartooning, comics, and graphic novels, did not win it.
I thought this was a shoe-in to win. It is such a monumental book. I've got it in front of me now. I mean, the thing is practically 4 inches high.
It's a tome.
It is a tome. It is. It's over 750 pages, and it's a hardcover book. I mean, you could put somebody in the hospital with this book easily. And the thing about this book that is so good, I mean, not only is 25 years quite an accomplishment for any publisher, but not only do you get you get interspersed throughout the book, you get a history of Drawn and Quarterly. You get features on some of the artists, some of the creators in this, and we're talking about people like Seth, people like Michael DeForge. We're talking about Adrian Tomaini. There are so many people here that are featured in this book.
Joe Matt.
It's and you get their work. You get little biographies about them. You get appreciations of them from other people. This is just an incredible book, and it's not something that was slapped together. I mean, here is Seth, an appreciation by Lemony Snicket. That in and of itself is going to be worth reading.
And didn't Seth do the covers to the Lemony Snicket books, or the design?
I think he did for some of that. And the way the book is put together, it's not just a slapdash thing that's like, oh, it's 25 years, let's just throw something together. This was really done with a lot of care. Most of the photographs in this book of the creators are in color, and it's not just, bleached out color. These are gorgeous prints.
Exactly.
And the reproductions here are just exquisite. If you can get your hands on this book, and you should, get it.
Yes, definitely do so. Now, you said a couple of times that, or you underscored the fact a couple of times that this book wasn't just slapped together real quickly. That 25 years, retrospective. And when this book was first solicited, that's what I thought it would be. Not that it would be slapped together in a half-dash way, but that it would be basically a repackaging of a variety of comics that they have published over the past 25 years, which would have been great.
Would have been fine.
It would have been great to do an anthology of this sort, kind of a Drawn and Quarterly reader for the first 25 years. And that's the reason why initially I did not get this book, because I thought, okay, I would probably have a lot of that stuff, not everything, but I want to take a look at it. And then when I found out later, once the book was released, I think at the Toronto TCAF several months ago, I found out that it was, as you described, maybe some older comics, a lot of newer material specifically for this volume, many profiles, appreciations, photographs. It's just a broad overview, a multi-feature overview of Drawn and Quarterly over the past 25 years, which makes it something really special. This was this was the one that should have won, and it gets back to something that I mentioned in the earlier segment. I wish that they had made a distinction between anthology and collection, because you're putting two different forms of text together in a way that's not on equal footing. They're two different things.
Right.
It's it just strikes me as a little unfair. In many ways, it's like putting short stories and novels in the same category when you're talking about prose. They're two different beasts. They may have similarities in a variety of ways, but the artists of each form doing very different things. So, I don't know. The Drawn and Quarterly is the only anthology in this, and it's dramatically different from Box Brown's An Entity Observes All Things, Eleanor Davis's How to Be Happy, Ethan Riley Popat's 4, and Gillian Tamaki's Super Mutant Magic Academy.
They are different, and to be fair, I have not read the Box Brown An Entity Observes All Things. I just picked that up over the weekend at SPX. But you're right. It's just a different animal. The anthology, as you said, is the only true anthology in this category. The rest of them are collections. And that is a different type of book. It just is.
Yeah. I was about to go into an analogy in prose fiction about the difference between a collection and an anthology, but I won't. I think we've made our point. Box Brown's collection, An Entity Observes All Things. We talked about this a few months ago when Kunka and I did our Retrofit Big Planet show, And this was one that we really liked. This is a series of stories. And, to some degree, maybe you could call this another form of graphic cycle, because the way that Brown links all of these stories, sometimes the subject matter is similar. It deals with things that are a little futuristic for the most part, but he also weaves together these stories a little tightly in the illustrations that begin each story. And these illustrations are forms of robots. So, for instance, I'm looking at about halfway through the story New Physics, and on the very first page of New Physics, there is a robot figure. Now, that robot figure really doesn't have anything to do at all to do with the story New Physics. Story after that is the System Corpus, and you have another robot figure on the first page of the System Corpus. That really doesn't have anything to do with the story, the System Corpus either. And that's the way it is with all of these stories. And so they're not only linked by this kind of futuristic, almost sci-fi theme among most, if not all of the stories, but also in the way that he introduces them. So, I mean, this is a really good collection. And if our listeners didn't hear our previous episode on Retrofit Big Planet, they should go back and listen to it, because we talk about Box Brown in more detail there. What about Outstanding Graphic Novel? Now, the winner there was Sophie Goldstein, and you and I had talked about The Oven when we did our Ad House Publisher Spotlight back in June. In fact, that episode came out the week of Heroes Con,
right.
And that's where we met Sophie. And I can't remember if we mentioned this in the earlier segment, but Sophie, who had heard that podcast soon after it went up, found out that we were tabling there, and she walked over to our table, introduced herself to us, and said, "I want to let you guys know that I really appreciate you talking about The Oven and what you had to say." And every now and again, a creator will email us or tweet us, "Thanks, I really like your in-depth analysis. I can, you understood where I was going." It's always good to hear that. But it's a rarity that someone will come up at a con in person and say, "Thank you very much, I appreciated it." And Sophie did.
Yeah, that was really nice to hear.
And then since then, I've made it a point of talking with her on a couple occasions. One for an extended period of time with her and Jen Jordan at Heroes Con, and I did the same thing at SPX, and that is going to be going up in a separate show. Probably that may have gone up by the time that this episode goes out. But you and I talked about The Oven at that time, so I don't want to get into a lot of detail. We've already discussed that one quite a bit. This is also in the category with St. Cole and Beauty by Kerskut and Hubert. And you were talking a little bit about this yesterday, I believe.
Yeah,
Beautiful work.
Yeah, absolutely gorgeous work. And the thing about this category is all 5 of these books are radically different. I mean, radically. They no 2 are anywhere close to being alike. Beauty is an absolutely gorgeous book, beautifully illustrated, a nice. It's almost like a fairy tale story with a new take on it. Absolutely gorgeous book. And The Oven we've spoken of before about the science fiction / relationship issues that are explored there. Rav, you spoke with Mickey Zacchili today. That was a really, really strange reading experience. But Derek, reading that book, I could not stop thinking about it after I read it. And it wasn't just what just happened. It's the way the book is put together, and it's sort of difficult to describe, because the book, as Derek is flipping through it right now, I'm reminded of it. The book is all printed on golden yellow pages, black ink on yellow pages.
Yellow and orangish.
Yellow and orangish. I don't know the correct hue to describe that. It's a very readable book on some levels. It's a very odd book. There are several pages where it's just not clear what's going on, but it was a compelling read for me. I really could not put it down, and after a little bit of time has passed, I want to pick it up again.
Yeah. And one of the things, you're right, I did talk with Mickey today, and I have to say, at first I thought that Mickey Zacchili was a guy because of the name Mickey, but then somewhere, and it may have been in the introduction, which is by Jacob Bernendez, he mentions she or her, and I thought, okay, well, maybe Mickey is a female's name, and indeed it is. And so when I talked with Mickey today, I asked her, I think I started off our interview, or close to the beginning, by asking her what I often ask many creators at cons, for our listeners, could you describe the book, your book, what it's about, or what's the premise? And so, because it's difficult to kind of ferret out what is going on in Rav, I asked her that question, not only for our listeners, but also for me. I mean, I have a sense of what's going on, but it is confusing. It is quite a bit abstract. And she was someone who was, let me just say, a little reticent. And not that she was being coy by not giving more detail. It's just she would answer the question with a few words and then let it rest at that. So I had to kept trying to tease out more information from her as I was speaking, and she really gave me nothing that I didn't already know in terms of Rav, which may be well enough. But this is a story about a few people, and she makes it easy because at the very beginning there is a character roster. And so we have a list of all of the main players and even some extremely minor players. The two main players in this story are Juice and Sally. And when we see Juice, a guy, and Sally, and he looks like I don't know if you'd call him a greaser. He has dark glasses, he has a cigarette, looks like he has a leather jacket. So that's why I guess the leather jacket and sunglasses reminded me of a greaser. They're out in what looks like a graveyard, and they see these, are they Satanist, or people are doing something in the graveyard.
Something they're not supposed to be doing.
Exactly. And one is, I guess, a cultist is what we would call him, a cultist. Yeah. One is someone named August, and he looks like he's in a sheet, not like a KKK member. At first I thought that may be it, but he looks like he dressed like a ghost, but not really a ghost. He's one of the occultists. And then there's some teens, and they're just called teens, in this graveyard as well. So the teens get attacked by the occultist, and then Juice gets involved and tries to ward off the occultist. And then Sally ends up leaving and gets pissed off with Juice, and so she takes his car and drives off, ends up at an IHOP. And in fact, I joked with Mickey today that, she must visit IHOPs because, IHOPs become very important in this story.
Prominent, yes.
And at least in the first half, when Sally is in the IHOP, a lot of other weird things happen. She ends up meeting several characters. One is a character by the name of Snake Prince Edward.
I love Snake Prince Edward.
Yes.
He's my favorite character.
And he is the one, it's interesting. He is the one who at first seems threatening, but then once he meets her, he's the one who protects her. And so a lot of these guys who are trying to hit on her or to do whatever at the IHOP, but Snake Prince Edwards fights them off.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then he starts following her around. So in the last half of the book, we see Sally and Snake Prince Edward, and they're out in the woods. Well, how did they get out in the woods? Well, why would we need to know that? Sequentiality and causality is not one of the high points of this book. So if you're looking for a cohesive narrative in terms of one event causally leading to another, you're going to be disappointed. But that's not what Zacchili is about here.
No. And I was actually trying to describe this to one of my coworkers, and I was telling her about, we were getting ready to do this podcast and the nominees. And I said, the closest I can come to describing this, it's like a combination of David Lynch and Dante's Inferno.
Okay, that's good.
So if you're into either one of those or both of those, I think you're really going to like this book. But, Derek, I'm really glad that this book was nominated because it's one of those books that you read it and you feel, I hope this book finds an audience. Because there's an audience out there for it. And it's one of those books that you might read and decide, this scratches an itch I didn't know I had. And I kind of felt that way because I really did like it. It took And like I said, it stuck with me. I kept thinking about it for quite a while. But had this book not been nominated, I feel like it might have really gotten overlooked. So I'm glad it was nominated.
Yeah, or at least it would have gotten overlooked by us. I know
Right.
I wouldn't have known about it. And the reason I say that is as we were driving back from SPX today, I was doing what I did yesterday. I was tweeting a number of the photographs that I made of the people that we interviewed. And I noticed that when I took a picture of Mickey and the tweet that had her photo and my comment about had a fun time talking with Mickey, listen to an upcoming episode, that got retweeted more than any tweets today that I put out. So she has a following. I just didn't know about her before the Ignatz Awards.
Yeah, I didn't either.
So that was an interesting find.
And I really didn't know all that much about Youth in Decline. I mean, I'd known about Youth in Decline, but I had never seen this book before we talked about it.
Yeah, and I don't think we thanked him on the show, but Ryan at Youth in Decline was very good in getting us not only a copy of Rav, but also some of the other books that we're discussing, one of which we'll get to in a moment, and that is Frontier.
So, yeah, definitely thank you, Ryan. This was a real treat.
It is. In fact, I was talking with Ryan today about maybe next year at some point doing a publisher spotlight on Youth in Decline.
Yeah, I would love that.
Yes, it would be great. Now, another book in the same category, outstanding graphic novel that I knew about, but I hadn't read until the Ignatz nominations, is Walter Scott's Wendy. And you read Wendy. What are your thoughts on this book? Because I know what they are because you've told me. That was a prompt for our listeners.
Yeah. To be honest, I read about the first maybe 30, 40 pages of Wendy and thought, boy, this is just not for me. And this really seems to be going nowhere. I waited a couple of days and I went back and I read the entire thing and I had a completely different take on it. Wendy is actually about an art, I guess she's an art student at the beginning of the book. And Wendy is having a difficult time trying to find her place in the art world. And yet she's still hanging out with a lot of her friends, partying, just doing crazy things. But she realizes that for her to make any advancement in the art world, she really needs to be more serious about her artwork and to hang out with people that are more serious about it. I won't get into all the details about it, but it really does have a lot more depth to it than I initially, on my first reading, like those first 30 or 40 pages, and I went back into it and I thought, wow, I really see what Scott is doing here. He's having a lot of fun with this, but at the same time, he's going into some real issues that artists, and not just artists, you could say the same thing about musicians or writers. It's that taking yourself seriously and in a way growing up as an artist. And he deals with a lot of these issues, and a lot of them he deals with in an absolutely hilarious way. The facial expressions that he has these characters go through, sometimes it's a really sudden thing, like just the way the eyes are done or the way the mouths are drawn, and the artistic people in the artistic world, the stereotypes, the high and mighty academic types. Everything in it really, really works. And it took me a while to get into it that second time, but I really, really enjoyed it that second time. It's a really interesting book that will appeal to anybody that's ever tried to do anything creatively.
Exactly. Now, you were mentioning musicians as well as artists here, and in this first half of the book especially, when Wendy is trying to get her sense of who she is as an artist and try to get some balance in her life, how much of her life her time should she devote to her art and how much to partying. And the partying seems to win out because she doesn't treat her work seriously, even though by the end of the first half there is some payoff to some of the art that she has. She's applied to go to, I guess, like it's an artist colony.
Right.
And she finds out at the end of the first section that, she was accepted. But most of this first half is a drama about her relationship with her friend Tina, her best friend Tina, and then a guy that she has the hots for who's a musician named Jeff. And Jeff looks all cheesy. You know, he has that little mustache, but apparently he's very sexy.
Yeah.
And so it's about love triangles. It's about unrequited love. It's about betrayal. And then in the background is her place as an artist and how she defines herself as such. Now, I was trying to think of the name of her friend, her gay friend, who is almost like a comic relief. Well, I would say it's almost like a comic relief, but the comic itself seems to be almost nothing but comic relief.
Right. He's the guy in the Scream mask, right?
Yes, exactly. And what is his name? I cannot remember for the life of me. I'm trying to find it. I'm looking from a PDF here. So that's one of the things about getting PDFs to review is that when you're trying to find answers, many times it's not easy to find the answer.
I'm sorry, Walter, that we can't get the character's name.
Yes.
Oh, and you
Screamo.
Screamo, of course. Yeah,
of course, the mask.
Yeah.
He is funny. And every now and again there is a little Screamo short story that it's almost like a comic interlude.
Yeah, and those are just priceless.
Right. But then when we get in the last half of the book, then Wendy becomes an artist. She has a successful time at the art colony, and then comes back home, and it's almost as if she's back where she started. She's had the experience. She's seen some of the peak of the art mountain, if you will. That sounds kind of cheesy now that I think about that. But now she comes back to her home, and she realizes, I got to deal with the mundane aspects of life. Right. I got to get a job. I need to make money. And so here is someone who was a successful, she thought, artist who is now having to work in a coffee shop. And then she ends up having a relationship with the manager of the coffee shop, who's really a nice guy, but for her represents kind of middle brow art. And I think that's one of the things that becomes so unsatisfying about that relationship. So we don't want to give away any spoilers on this, but I think from what Andy and I have both mentioned, I mean, this is a drama. And it does deal with character in the way that some of these others have dealt with character, as we mentioned, Eleanor Davis and Noah Van Sciver especially. Maybe not as deeply, but we do get to feel for Wendy and pull for her. So my guess is that when you went back to reread it after that first attempt, that it was Wendy's character that got you really going there, that you wanted to see how she turned out?
I think it was, and I think I probably thought from those first 30 pages, oh, I know where this is going, which is always a dangerous assumption to make. And it was unfair of me to make that, so I'm glad I went back through it, spent some more time. And, I think there's a lot of richness in it. I think there's a lot of depth in it. And, we definitely would recommend this.
Certainly. Now, another category we've talked maybe a little bit about, but not much, and that is outstanding story. And here, I was thinking that maybe Dash Shaw's The Doctors, which I think you and I both talked about that on an episode last year. I thought that was a strong story, but then again, I'm predisposed to Dash Shaw. I love his work, and I think it's always good when he comes out with a new comic. But I know another contender that I think you were really excited about, and I could definitely see winning the award, is the story Nature Lessons. And this is from the book by Marguerite Van Cook and James Romberger, The Late Child and Other Animals. And this came out from Fantagraphics. I have to say, this is another one of those texts that I would call a story cycle. Because each of the stories in Late Child and Other Animals could easily stand on their own, but they're all interlinked through character.
Right.
Yes. So a very good example of story cycle. The art here is just outstanding.
It really is. And again, the isolated story that we have here, Nature Lessons is, without giving away too much, is about we see very early these two young girls, and they're both at a young age are very independent, very smart, even very street smart, and yet one of them encounters a predator, a child molester, and you think you know where this story is going, but it doesn't go where you think it is going to go. And not only do we get the character of the girl, and again, a highly intelligent young lady, we also get the character, extremely disturbing, of this predator, and how these two characters work together. I mean, we've seen these horrific stories, unfortunately, in real life and in fiction as well, on television and movies. This was portrayed at such a level of depth that was just stunning. The way the art style works with this, the colors are absolutely brilliantly done. The pacing of the story is brilliant. To me, this was the strongest story in a category of extremely strong stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you see this as a collection, I don't see why this wasn't nominated also for the best anthology or collection. I think that what Van Cook and Romberger do here that I really love is these are realistic stories for the most part, but they're interwoven with, at times, dreamlike or fantasy segments where you many times are generated by characters' thoughts, sometimes characters' perceptions. So, what is the name? And I know this is not the story itself because we were talking about Nature Lessons, but there's another story in Late Child. I think it's the second one, when the woman who adopts a daughter and then has another daughter by someone who's not her husband, but her husband had died during the Second World War. Now she's going before a group of men who are deciding what may be the best for her child. Kind of like in A Scarlet Letter way, It very much like the Hawthorne classic. And the way she is perceiving her situations, the men who sit in judgment of her are these crows. And they're looking down at her. It's almost like they're pecking down at her with their little beady eyes, and they want to try to find things that are wrong with her. Now, obviously, in this story, the men are not crows, but she perceives them as such. And so you get a kind of almost expressionistic way of storytelling here where her inner emotions become an outer reality for her and then for us as the reader, of course, of this comic. But getting back to Nature's Lessons, I think one of the things that makes this story and then the entire collection so powerful is the way that the creators have been able to meld a more fantastical, maybe an expressionistic way of storytelling with a more realistic form as well. Now, another book in this category we cannot speak to, and that is Chris Mouquet's Weeping Flower Grows in Darkness. And this was also nominated for which other award? The Outstanding Comic. I can't speak to it. You can't speak to it unless you've seen it that I'm not aware of, Andy.
No, I think I actually did see it this week for sale, but I did not.
Really?
Or maybe I didn't. Maybe I've just looked at this website so many times that I think I did see it. But yeah, that's the one that neither of us were able to get a copy of.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate. But one copy that you and I were able to get our hands on, again, thanks to Ryan at Youth in Decline, is issue number 7 of Frontier. And this is a story. Actually, this entire issue is Sex Coven, the story by Gillian Tamaki. And although Gillian Tamaki did not win for the 2 times she was nominated for Super Mutant Magic Academy, she did win for the best or the outstanding story category. And maybe we should preface this to our readers by mentioning that this series, Frontier, comes out, I guess it's about once a year, and it is each issue is a story, or at least each issue is written by, from what I gather, one artist. Okay, so it's not an anthology,
right?
So this issue that was up for nomination, issue number 7, was written by Gillian Tamaki, and the title is Sex Coven. And this is an interesting story. Sex Coven is a song and a phenomena that I think it takes us to the beginning. It says, in early 1999, a user named _Eye of the Kush found the folder on the music sharing site SoundsWire. And of course, in the late 90s, that there were a few of, there was Napster. It was the most notorious, I guess. It contained a single MP3, also untitled. And then in this folder, the 17-year-old _Eye of the Kush senior named Gordy Wynn. So this is the guy who had that username. Downloaded the track and renamed it Sex Coven, and it continued to share it via his SoundsWire account. And what happens is that this MP3 that is now renamed from Untitled to Sex Coven starts to have an effect on the young listeners, but not on older listeners. And there's something, how would you describe the effect of the youth? Something euphoric?
Yeah, something euphoric and that makes you lose pretty much all, I won't say rational thought, because there's still rational thought going on. But it reminds me, and I can't put my finger on it, one of those movies where you watch this videotape and you die or something like that. It's not that cut and dried. It's a lot more subtle, and there's a lot more layering to this story, but it does talk a lot about a certain time and a certain community that builds up around a certain thing that is connected with technology. That's one of the things about it that appealed to me, and you have this small group of people that are drawn together and stay together, and they pretty much become something of a fringe movement. And that has really incredible consequences as the book draws near to the end. This, I can see why this story won. Again, this is a powerful story from a whole bunch of powerful stories in this nomination. I think Gillian Tamaki does an expert job of portraying these people and what they go through without making it simplistic. There are still a lot of questions to be asked at the end of this story. But again, I think we see this over and over with these great stories, like we saw with Nature Lessons, we saw with, we haven't really talked about Michael DeForge's Me as a Baby, or That Much Doctors, other than when we did it last time on the podcast. But this story is a very relationship-based story, and that's what makes it work. And I think Tamaki understands that about her characters in this, as well as the Super Mutant Magic Academy. It's really all about relationships.
Now, you mentioned, I hadn't thought of Sex Coven, the story, as about relationships. If it is about relationships, we don't see it until maybe the second half, because in the first half we have the setup. There's the premise, as I mentioned, and youth that are starting to listen to this in the late 90s and into the early 2000s, it's not necessarily like a drug, but it's something like a drug in that it creates this sense of euphoria, a sense of being carefree, to the point that when kids are listening to this song, they're not really aware of their surroundings. They're not careful. Some are killed or maybe even maimed by falling down or falling into holes or in gulches, being hit by cars, wandering off in the woods, and ending up lost. And so the parents are, well, first off, wondering, what is it about this song that is so mesmerizing, almost literally, to the kids and not the adults? But at the same time, they're thinking, we must do something about this. And so this becomes almost a metaphor for the way that an older generation always tries to regulate the kind of entertainment that their children are consuming for usually misguided reasons. So that's what's going on here. But in the second half of this story, we get what's called the Tech. And the Tech is a group of individuals who are, as the name suggests, very tech savvy. and go into this MP3 file. They try to analyze it. They break down the sound waves. They try to manipulate the sound wave in certain ways in order to try to pinpoint what is it about this sound that is in the MP3 and what does it do with the brain and in what ways that causes this. They don't really come to any answers, but what the tech ends up becoming is what you said a moment ago, Andy, is this sense of community. So the tech is a group of people who tried to analyze this song, weren't really successful at doing so, but then that effort gives them a new meaning and a new direction in life. And so they become kind of outcasts themselves. They become they take up a residence out at Joshua Tree. And I mean, this becomes like almost a back to the earth community that is based largely on their earlier efforts to try to figure out, what the hell's going on with this song, Sex Coven. And so then we have, and what is the woman's name, the character who ends up narrating this story? But we don't know until the end, and I don't think that's a giveaway. No,
it's not a giveaway. And you're right. I mean, things do take a different turn. In the second half of the story, I think it becomes more personal for these two characters, and we learn so much more about them. It's not so much about the premise.
Rave, that's her name, Rave.
But it's about these two characters that really it really becomes very powerful. It reminds me, Derek, and you've probably, I'm sure we've both known people that. I think about this girl I knew in high school that was really, really into a certain band in the 70s, and a band that was very popular for a very short time. Long after the band had disappeared from most people's memory, her and a friend of hers were still supremely dedicated to this group, beyond the point where it was laughable to everybody else around them. And this is somewhat kind of like that, and I think Tamaki is dealing somewhat with this situation. What do you have left when the thing that you worship has been forgotten by everybody else?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
All you have is that relationship with this other person, if you still have that.
Now, another category, and this is one that I think could be the most interesting to discuss, and this is promising new talent. And again, nominated for this is M. Dean with KM and RP and 1971. Kind of a long, awkward title, but fun. Sophia Foster Domino with both Sphincter and Sex Fantasy. Dakota McFadzean, Don't Get Eaten by Anything. June May with Soft. And Gina Winbrandt, Big Pussy. There's so much to talk about in this category. And maybe we'll begin. Okay, let me preface this by saying I mean no disrespect to Sophia Foster Domino, who actually won this. I do like her work. I do like all of the issues of Sex Fantasy that I've read and the story Sphincter. But to me, I find these other works much more, I don't know, dare I say promising, or at least interesting. There seems to be more meat there to chew on and discuss. With M. Dean, I have to say, I was absolutely bowled away by her art. And we were both sent copies of the book KM and RP in 1971. And, you were talking about Sex Coven is about a relationship. Or eventually becomes about a relationship. This book is all about a relationship. It's between two young girls leading up to their graduation from high school. One is named Kennedy, and the other is Rhea. And Rhea is the one who is the narrator for this short comic. The book itself is for a mini comic. I guess we can call it a mini comic because it's a rather large format. There's nothing mini size-wise about it, but it is mini in the sense that it is very short.
Yeah, the page count is short.
Yes, exactly. But also, this is a much more cohesive story than you find in, let's say, most mini comics. At least most mini comics that I'm familiar with. It's a very short story, and it's about these two girls, both of whom want to be writers, and they have the desire, but it's kind of like Wendy, as we were discussing earlier.
I was just thinking about Wendy.
They don't have much of the energy or determination or oomph, whatever you want to call it, or dedication, to actually become the writers. And the difference between the two is that Kennedy is really bothered by that fact, but Rhea, is able to live with it. She is someone, Rhea, the narrator of this story, rolls with the punches, so to speak. And basically her philosophy is that, if our expectations aren't being met by reality, then maybe we ought to readjust our expectations. And Kennedy thinks that that's kind of a sellout. Mm-hmm. And so we have two close friends who, right before the end of the story, seem to be close to breaking up, so to speak,
right?
In terms of the directions their lives are taking, but that there is some kind of almost coming together. I do think that this does have a nice ending, and it does end upon graduation.
And again, Derek, there's absolutely nothing against sex fantasy. I thought that was a great story. I mean, everything in this
series,
everything was really good. We've talked before about "Don't Get Eaten by Anything" by Dakota McFadzean. We both really enjoyed that. Soft was a book that I did not get into fully. I only gave it a cursory look, so I can't really say much about that. Big Pussy was a very, very unusual, but it was one of those books that we both thought was so unique in so many ways that was intriguing. All of these books were
Big Pussy?
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to talk about that a little more, but go ahead.
All of these books were intriguing, but the new talent that I look forward to hearing more from or seeing more from the most is M. Dean.
Yeah, I agree. And, I was rooting for Dakota McFadzean. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, to me, he wasn't so much a new talent in that I had known some of his earlier work. And I'm wondering if the judges who selected the creators for this category, if they were aware of earlier things that he had done. And, even if you limit it to the stories that are in Don't Get Eaten by Anything, Don't Get Eaten by Anything, and I have the copy here in front of me, this is a collection of his online The Dailies comics beginning in 2011. So how new is this new talent, Dakota McFadzean?
Right. He's probably been around. I don't know if he's been around longer than these other ones, but we have known of his work for quite some time.
Exactly. So this may be something that tells us something a little bit about the judges' efforts and the insights, or maybe lack thereof, in pulling this together. I mean, I'm fine with him being a new talent, but he is not new this year or the past even 2 or 3 years. He's been around for quite a while, and I really love the stories in Don't Get Eaten by Anything. I think that was a great collection. And these are strips, okay? Mm-hmm. So these are, as the titles or the subtitles suggest, dailies. And some of these are extremely offbeat. Some are a little more cute. Mm-hmm. Some are amusing. And some are quite dark. Mm-hmm. I like that mixture. I think that it's a wonderful recipe that you throw everything into this book. And it's also quite a thick book. And it's a nice package as well. If you look at this hard copy, Conundrum did a wonderful job in putting this together. And I think that in the late spring, when this came out, when their seasonals came out, this was one that I think that they highlighted the most. So it strikes me as something that makes sense to be nominated for an Ignatz Award.
Yeah, it's a really nice book, and again, kudos to Conundrum for publishing this. I mean, this is a pretty hefty book, and it's really reasonably priced. And to put this entire thing out, I think it was a pretty bold move, and I think it was a great move.
Yeah.
But like you said, not really a new talent.
Exactly, and I love Dakota's art, and I think that in terms of all of the nominees in this category, Dakota's and M. Dean's are the two that really stand out to me. Mm-hmm. But as we said, Dakota's been around for quite a while, and it was M. Dean that had a big chance to win this. To me, the one that stands out the most, because it's so weird, is Gina Winbrandt's Big Pussy, and I met her at Small Press Expo yesterday, and I talked with her, and I can say that that will be on one of the interview shows that we do. And my brief conversation with Gina it struck me that she's the kind of person who would write a mini comic like Big Pussy. And this is strange. How do we describe this story? Basically, as she described it to me, it is kind of a coming of age story, and this is about her kind of growing up and needing to get out of her parents' home. And it's largely based on the manga Sailor Moon, which is a title that I know my daughter Zoe is very familiar with. But she can't use the title Sailor Moon in her comic here. So the anime, I guess, that she watches is Lunar Diamond.
Right.
And so it deals with, I guess, a kind of a princess-like character and an animal. In this case, it's a cat. And so this relationship between human and cat in Lunar Diamond portends what happens as this story unfolds, because the character Gina in this story is looking to kind of grow up and to be able to stand on her own. And she comes across this collection of 4 feral cats. And basically... I'm looking through this comic. And by the way, the way that the color of this comic, it's all pink. It's pink on white paper. And in a way, it kind of makes it a little difficult to read.
Yeah.
But once you get used to that, it gets fun. So anyway, Gina comes across this group of feral cats. And we should mention that all 4 of the cats have human faces. Creepy as hell.
That is really. It reminded me of the 1978 Invasion of the Body Snatchers. That scene with the dog with the guy's face on it.
Oh God!
And it freaks you out just as much here as it did in that movie.
Yeah. So she sees this group of cats and says, "What's up, cats?" And then the cats, they're kind of jaded. It's like, "Yeah." And she asked them, "Listen, I was wondering if y'all could, take me in, mentor me, help me become a little tougher and more prepared at entering adulthood, which happens to be on my 24th birthday later this week." It's basically Lunar Princess. And, again, referring to Sailor Moon. And the cat's response is, "Fuck off, kid." And she goes, "Oh, what if I paid you $400? And they say, $500. And then one of the cats says, "So you want to be tough, huh?" And they try to teach her to be tough. And so they have her go through a series of trials and tribulations, one of which includes cleaning the cats. So she licks them clean, and of course she gets hairballs. And she keeps crying every time. "Oh, I can't do this." And that's where the title comes from.
That's where the title is, yeah.
They call her the Big Pussy. Quit crying. You got to toughen up. And the way that they have her toughen up... Now, she did mention this in the interview. We'll forego this because...
Okay, I was going to say you don't want to say too much.
And we'll say that we won't say too much because we don't want to give away spoilers.
Right.
But there may be other reasons there. Let's just say that this is not a comic you would want to give your young child.
No.
But it is hilarious.
Mm-hmm.
It is unlikely, and it is funny as hell. So because it is so damn offbeat, I was hoping, this would be the dark horse in that category.
Yeah,
this would be the one. And she didn't win, and it was funny. When I found out last night that Gina did not win this category, I tweeted her and I said, unfortunately, in fact, someone just retweeted us, I guess. Too bad that they didn't appreciate this, but at least you have Best American Comics 2015. Gina has a piece in this year's Best American Comics. I just got my copy
for her.
Earlier this week,
yeah.
And so she's really happy about that. So Gina Winbrandt, you're having a very big year, and we're happy that Big Pussy was a part of our conversation on this episode.
And we look forward to see what you will do next.
Yeah, and thank you very much, Gina, for sending us copies.
Yes.
Another one in this category we haven't really talked much about, I know you say you didn't get to look at it as closely as I did, is Jane May's Soft. This is another mini comic, but it's a mini comic that's kind of thick. It's the size of a mini comic, but there are quite a number of pages here. And this is an interesting story. Again, it deals with relationships. So you have the main character named Laura. and she's talking about a relationship. The one time in her early life when she was 15 that she fell in love. And she fell in love with a girl named Carmilla. The thing is that Carmilla is not what she appears to be. I don't want to say much more than that because then we would be approaching spoiler territory. But Carmilla becomes an enigmatic friend, someone who's not the most healthy choice as a friend if Laura wants to keep her other friends, her other relationships, both family and the people that she hangs out with at school. So it does take a strange and darker turn toward the end. There are parts of this story that I think were really well written. There are others where there are gaps in the storytelling that struck me as accidental, unintentional gaps. I mean, there may be times that a writer will include blank spots, gaps in the narrative for a purpose, and that is consciously constructed. I think that there are cases where the story is not as cohesive in certain places in Soft, and I think they're unintentional. And I think maybe, I do not know how old Jane May is, but it could be that she is a younger story writer, which makes sense if she's a promising new talent, that she's learning the craft now. And I really did enjoy Soft, but it's a kind of book that tells me that it's one where she is learning her craft.
Right. So it could be like, and a lot of the creators that we are looking at here are, we know that they're on the young side because we've met them. And and again, not that there's anything wrong with that, but there is that learning curve. And one of the things that and we were talking about this before, somebody like Noah Van Sciver, who is still a young person, but maybe a little bit older than some of the other nominees in some of these categories. And I think you see that reflected in his work, not only in the maturity of the work, but again, as we've spoken before, he's very prolific. He has the combination of years experience and just doing the job over and over and over, I think gives him something that maybe some of these other creators maybe do not have yet. And I think maybe, again, I have not read Soft, but you have. Maybe that's something that we see in Soft, is that development hasn't quite matured yet. But still, the talent is there enough for a nomination to come through.
Exactly. And, part of it, I do think, is youth and learning the craft. But another thing, you and I were talking about this over breakfast. There strikes me something about both mini comics and web comics that both of them, to a certain degree, are testing grounds. Okay,
Yeah.
That's where artists can learn to do what they will eventually become adept at. And in this case, it's the storytelling, cohesive storytelling. I mentioned earlier that there were a number of webcomics that we've discussed where, the artist, the story kind of almost meanders in places. It's looking for a direction. And then once the artist finds the groove, maybe sometimes with the help, maybe sometimes in spite of the quote-unquote help of the reader responses, then they get into the story proper and the trajectory really takes off. I think a good example of that is, and I've used this example before, Noelle Stevenson's Nimona. That was a book that as a webcomic, I think it may have been better than as a printed book, because as a printed book, it seems to meander from one point to another, and then by the time you get to the second half, it's a little different than the first half, and I think she was trying to find her voice. That's okay. That happens in a webcomic. Things develop. You can see the artist, not just the story, develop over time. I think similar things go on with mini comics as well, because that's kind of an under-the-radar format, and so it doesn't have the kind of profile that a book, and not even by a major publisher, let's say like Fantagraphics or even Harcourt, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, but even smaller presses, those books, have time to germinate, and the writer, and they may serialize part of it, but they have a larger plan, and so they have mapped out the story. They know where it's going. So it does have more crafted cohesion. So I think that part of it, as we were mentioning with Soft, may be the age of and the experience of the creator, but also part of it may be the format, in this case, the mini comic.
And I wonder, too, how much the creators that do the mini comics learn from that experience, like you said, it may not be, the exposure may not be as wide as it might be in a webcomic. But actually, I was telling you, Derek, that one of the panels I went to today was about publishing through a small press, and Box Brown was on that panel. And he was talking about the advantages. He said, so many people want to write a 300-page graphic novel. Well, that's great. That's probably going to take you 2 years. Get a mini comic out there first. You can get it done, fairly quickly. Get it out there. Start on another one. Get it out there. And in the time it would have taken you to do a graphic novel, you can have several mini comics, and you can see your own progress in that time, and you can see your own growth and how you've matured over that amount of time that you wouldn't necessarily see if you spend 2 years working on a graphic novel. And I think we see that in some of these comics, as we see the beginnings of growth. And it would be interesting to look at some of the future work of some of these creators to see how that develops through mini comics or other formats. But I think mini comics, you probably learn a tremendous amount. And it doesn't take you, I know those things, even a mini comic takes time, but the learning curve is much quicker.
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of outstanding series, what won for this is, again, Sex Fantasy from Sophia Foster Domino, but the other nominees is Georgia Weber's Dumb, Ryan Sand's Frontier series that we mentioned earlier, Ethan Riley's Pope Hats, but also this is probably the most quote-unquote mainstream, if we want to call it that, the most high-profile nominee of all of the Ignatz nominees this year, and that is March by John Lewis, Andrew Aiden, and Nate Powell. I was really surprised that this didn't win the category, but on the other hand, I'm not, given the nature of SPX. Mm-hmm. You were saying that last year Nate Powell was at SPX. He was not there this year. Is that correct? He
right.
Was there last year?
He was there last year, and I thought his name was on the roster for this year, but I didn't see him. And I spoke to somebody at one of the tables where his work was on display, and they said, no, he's not here. And
I saw him tweet to say, I'm sorry I can't be there.
Yeah,
but
yeah. Derek, the thing we talked about before, I think the thing about March is somewhat similar to the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings movies. It didn't get the Oscar until the last movie was nominated. And I think we're going to see that when the third book of March comes out. I think we're going to see a lot of awards go March's way, and maybe even the outstanding series.
Okay, I think for other awards, yes. For Eisner's, yes. For Harvey's, yes. For others, yes. For Ignatz, I don't think so. And I'll tell you, it's because the privileging of the Ignatz is on the very small, independent, either creators or publishers. Mm. So given the fact that March is published by Top Shelf, which now is distributed through or subsidiary of IDW, I really don't see this as the kind of book, the kind of series in this case, that Ignatz voters or those who attend SPX would necessarily gravitate to. Maybe I'm wrong there. Maybe I'm not being as optimistic as I should be. Obviously I love March. We talked about March Book 2 at the beginning of the year on a podcast, a regular review show. So it both did and didn't surprise me that this didn't get it. We haven't really talked much about Georgia Weber's Dumb, and what do you think of that series? Because how many issues do we have out? Let me pull up the PDF.
I think there are 8.
There are 8 that are out.
Yeah.
And the premise of this is that we have Georgia so this is autobiographical, or at least I'm assuming it is she is writing about a situation or a condition she has where she has worked in an environment where it has strained her voice to the point that she needs to rest it. And I'm not talking about resting in terms of talking softly or talking less frequently. Her doctors are telling her she shouldn't talk at all. Mm-hmm. And so over a series of so far 8 issues, it's her story about having to deal with the reality of not being able to speak as she would like, and both the expected and unintended and unexpected consequences of this condition. The art is fairly simple and straightforward. It reminds me of the work of another nominee that we'll talk about in a moment, and that is John Porcellino. It just reminds me about some of his art. But the story is very personal, and it's very emotional because of that. And we can see at times Weber break down. We can see her when she feels relief. We can see her as she's trying to be understood, but frustrated that she can't be understood. But even her closest friends.
Right. And Derek, what you said about the art is true. There's a lot of, in some ways, there's a lot of simplicity in it, the line drawings. But the further we get into the series, the more complex the art gets, too.
That's a good point.
And there's a lot of experimental things being done with the art, with color. I think it is a challenging work the farther along you go. The beginning of it, again, it's one of those comics where you think you know where it's going to go. You see the premise, you think you understand what's going to happen. But the level of complexity with Dumb really does get quite intricate.
Now that you mention this, I was incorrect in making a comparison to Porcelino because the art isn't as minimalist. Now, especially in the later issues, it is a little more minimalist early on.
At first, yes.
Yeah, but again, and I'm glad you pointed this out, one of the joys of reading Dumb is that you get to see, it's kind of like what we were talking in terms of webcomics, you get to see an artist grow and develop and her art change over time. Not just in terms of subject matter, but in terms of the art itself, her style. And it does become much more detailed in places. In later issues, she starts to do really interesting things with color and in collage.
And in collage, too, yes.
Yeah. So,
there's also a nice prose element to certain, or maybe all of the issues. There are quotes from
essays,
brief essays from other creators.
Yeah, talking about not so much just losing one's voice literally, but also the significance of voice, both literally and figuratively. So I think that this is a wonderful series, and she has a Patreon campaign, does she not?
I think she does.
Okay, so, and I think this is how much of this is funded. So, I would strongly recommend that our listeners check out Dumb and find Weber's Patreon account. And we don't have that website up right now, but it definitely is an interesting series. Now, the next category is Outstanding Comic, and some of these are titles that we've discussed already. There is Sophie Goldstein's The Oven, Ethan Riley's Pope Hats #4, and then one that we haven't seen, Mukay's Weeping Flower Grows in Darkness. There are two other titles here, Dissa Wallander's Nature of Nature, which is an interesting story that's got a great sense of humor, and it's about a woman who is, or a young girl, it looks like, who is talking about nature, and she's wanting to find out the gist or the nature of nature.
Right. What's it all about?
Yeah, what makes it nature? And it's a series of interesting observations. This is what I think if we take Little Lulu and PBS and mash them together, then we would get something like The Nature of Nature. In fact, the subtitle is "The Earth is Square Like You," so it's definitely got a great sense of humor. For me, what really stands out in this category is a book that I was pulling for, and this is Jason Little's Borb. I had the pleasure of talking with Jason at SPX today, and he was telling me quite a bit about the genesis of this project and what it's all about. I won't go into too much detail there because our listeners can hear that interview. But this started off as kind of a somewhat experimental project for Jason in that he wanted to do a daily comic. And with probably, I think, one exception, all of the comics in this, and they're strip-like. And in fact, the hard copy of the book, and I did get a copy from Uncivilized, it's in long format like the 4-panel strip. And what Jason would do is to put a strip up each day. And he wanted to force himself to do kind of a comic a day, a strip a day. And the story is based on this homeless guy. And we see him, at least in the first part of the story, as almost a clown-like figure. If you can think of Charlie Chaplin or Buster Keaton, the kind of slapstick, humor-based, silent films, it's very much similar to that. And in fact, you have sound effects, but you don't have dialogue in the first, 2/3 or 3/4 of this book. So in many ways, it is reminiscent of a silent film. But then I think in the last half, especially the last third of Borb, it starts to take a little more serious turn. And you have things happening to the homeless guy whose name I think is Bob. And in fact, I was trying to confirm that with Jason, and he says that the name is mentioned at one point in the book. So I guess the title Borb gets its significance from a mispronunciation of the name Bob, because at one point Bob can't speak well, and so he's standing on the street asking for handouts, and he tells someone, Borb is who he is. So that's where it gets its name from. But it does take a darker turn. And I don't want to give anything away, but this doesn't become kind of funny slapstick all the way through. But it's definitely one that is worth checking out. It's not often that we get a work from Jason Little. I know I was first familiar with him with his single issue, Jack's Luck Runs Out. And then he did a couple of books after that. One is Shutterbug Follies, and then the other one, whose title escapes me, Motel Service. It's got 4 words in the title. And both that one and Shutterbug Follies he described as bubblegum noir. They're kind of for all age or maybe even a little younger readers, but it does deal with a mystery. And he wanted to do something a little more adult, going back to what he did several years ago with Jack's Luck Runs Out. So Borb is something that you should definitely read. Now, the penultimate category that we're going to be discussing, let's go ahead and say the last category we're going to be discussing, because Andy and I admit we did not have time to read much, if anything, from the Outstanding Online comic.
Which is pretty bad, because they're all available for free.
Yeah, this is the great irony. When we decided we would do this show, Andy, we thought, okay, well, we know we have the online comics. Now we have to see if we can get our hands on either the hard copy or the digital copies of the others in the categories that we didn't already have. I don't know what that says about us, that we never got around to
it's pretty bad.
the web comics. But Lily Carey won for The Bloody Footprint. Others in that category, Lauren Weinstein's Carriers, Rebecca Rohr's Mom Body, Blue Delicanti, Oh Human Star, and Ariel Reese's Witchy. So I look forward to giving them the attention that they deserve. So I want to go and read them. We're sorry we did not read your online comics.
We're sorry.
Yeah.
Please forgive us.
We won't do it next year. We promise. But the ones that we did read, or some of the ones that we read, were in the Outstanding Mini Comics series. Again, there are a couple that we weren't able to get our hands on. So, for instance, Epoxy number 5 by John Pham, we never saw, nor did we see Audrey's Wayland A Reckoning. But the others that we read, Sex Fantasy number 4 by the ever-present Sophia Foster Domino, and then there was Patrick Crotty's Devil's Slice of Life, which is, I think A Devil's Slice of Life is a mini-comic in the true sense of a mini-comic.
Yeah.
It's short, it's sweet, it's fun, it gets in, it gets out, it does what it intends to do, it doesn't aspire to anything grandiose. So it was fun. Now, by saying it does what a mini-comic does, it doesn't aspire to anything grandiose, that's not entirely fair to the guy that I really wanted to see win this category, and that is John Porcellino with King Cat number 75. I don't know, Andy, I don't know of another creator in comics that is loved as much by other creators than John Porcellino. So many people that we've talked to on the show, so many people that I've written to, have just sung John Porcellino his praises, and not in a way to kind of inflate him, but in a way that suggests that there's kind of a warmth and closeness there, and an appreciation of him as a person and also of his work. And I can see that in his King Cat comics, which I was familiar with, before. But here we're talking specifically about issue number 75 of King Cat. And, boy, This is a powerful book. This does aspire to something besides the cute, quick fun.
Oh, yeah. And again, I did not, like Derek, was not able to read all of the books in this category, but that was such a powerful book. And I've known of Porcelino's work before, but I had never really seriously read any of it before this. And I am not a cat person. I have a dog. So I thought, I'm probably not going to like this. I'm probably not the audience for this book. Derek, I love this book. It's got so much humanity in it, and you don't have to be a cat lover to love it. Porcelino does such a wonderful job. And again, I think you described it as minimalist earlier. The art style is very, very much line drawing. I mean, literal lines. Simple but not simplistic. I think we use that term a lot. Very easy to read. A child could pick up this comic and understand it visually, and even with the text as well. It's a very simple story. It's a very human story. It's a very moving story, and that Porcelino is able to do all of those things so well is just tremendous.
Exactly, and. Yeah, he's someone that I wish I had the opportunity to actually speak with for in a brief interview while I was there at XPX. But unfortunately, I didn't see him until everyone was starting to pack up. Mm-hmm. So I do want to have him on the show at some point. But yeah, I'm kind of a cat person, not a big cat person. I'm more of a dog person like you. One of the things that struck me about this story about a cat of his named Maisie is, I have a dog, and, I was telling you about this earlier, Chester, and he's getting up there. He's 10 years old, and for large breed dogs, that's pretty old. That's pretty old. He also is having joint problems, and over the past several months, I've been thinking more and more about the fact that Chester's not going to be with me forever, and, I feel a little teary right now just saying that, but, he means a lot to me, just as Maisie meant a lot to John, and he writes about this in such a moving way that I felt really emotional as I was getting toward the end of King Cat number 75. So this was a wonderful book, in a variety of ways. Andy, we have. It's getting kind of late, and we have. This show is going to be longer than our normal shows, but then again, we're looking at the Ignatz nominees, so there's a lot packed into this. Yeah,
we're looking at quite a number of books. I mean, we are literally looking at every book that was nominated, so it's quite an undertaking to read them and to discuss them too. But this has been a really rich experience to read all of these books. To be in the atmosphere where they are discussed, where they are voted on, where they are celebrated. And even though, we had a very small part in it in the voting process anyway, we are vested in a certain manner of speaking in these books and having read them. I think we are both richer for having read them. And one of the most exciting things, as we alluded to before, is to see what these creators do from here.
Exactly.
Not just the ones that won, but the ones that were nominated that didn't win too. There is a certain expectation when you have been nominated or when you have won, what are you going to do next? So, in a manner of speaking, the pressure is on for some of these creators for us to see where they will go next.
Yeah, and I like the way you put it, that we do have an interest in this, in that this is a large part of what the Comics Alternative is all about, the Ignatz Awards.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of books here. There are a lot of great ones that you guys should definitely check out. And in fact, if you go to the website of our sponsor's sister company, now our sponsor's Discount Comic Book Service, one of their sister companies is In Stock Trades. If you go to InStockTrades.com, you will find wonderful discounts on many of the titles that we've been discussing. So for instance, you can find Noah Van Sciver's St. Cole at 30% off. So instead of paying $19.99, you only pay $13.99. Or if you're looking for Sophie Goldstein's The Oven, you can find it for 29% off. Instead of paying $12.95, $9.71. Same thing with Super Mutant Magic Academy by Jillian Tamaki at 25% off the cover price. Instead of paying $22.95, you get $17.21 of goodness, Super Mutant Magic Academy. And there are a lot more discounts than that. You have to go to their website, InStockTrades.com or DCBService.com. After you do get your comics there, Ignatz Award winners and otherwise, get in touch with us and let us know what you think about these books. If you go to our website, ComicsAlternative.com, you should see a tab in the right-hand side of your browser that says Send Voicemail. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can send us a voice message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. Very simple and easy to use. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way, on the telephone. Our number is 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And if you want to see firsthand everything that we did, the best way to do at SPX, the best way to do that is to see us on Twitter. We are at the number 2 guys with PhDs. And not only do you get news about content on the blog, but updates to what podcasts are coming out, and again, some great pictures from SPX.
That's right. So check us out on Twitter. You can also find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, on Google+, and on Pinterest. And of course, we like to hear from you via email. If you want to contact us at the show, we're 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can contact me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And Andy?
You can contact me at Wolverton@comicsalternative.com.
You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can find us on TuneIn. And as always, you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as our reviews and our comics-related commentary that we publish on our blog. And that's at the website, comicsalternative.com.
Yeah, so we hope you will find something to explore on this list of nominees and winners of the Ignatz Awards. And when you do, let us know what you think.
Yeah, we like to hear from you. And until the next show, over and out. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy.
We'll see you later.